Summer 1942, Paris. In France, in the occupied zone, the Germans decreed that all Jews over the age of 6 must wear a yellow star. This identity marker was a way to single out the Jews whom the Nazis regarded as vermin and facilitate their arrest. Aged 12 at the time, Annette Krascher lived with her mother and sister in Rue Sévigné in Paris's 3rd district. Her father was away working at one of Marshal Pétain's longing camps. Rachel Jedinak, who was 8, lived in Rue Duris in the 20th district with her mother and sister. Her father had been arrested in a roundup the previous year. And Joseph Weissman, who was then 12, lived with his parents and 2 sisters in the 18th district's Rue des Abbesses. They will never forget the yellow star.
The yellow star, we had to go buy it and pay for it with clothing ration coupons. How ironic is that?
My mother took me by surprise and said, "Come on, I'll sew it in the right place." When I saw what she was sewing on, I screamed, "I don't want to wear it."
I was expecting people to spit at me, throw stones, and dogs to pee on me.
Some children still wanted to play with me, others refused. And I got called a dirty Jew.
According to my parents' way of thinking, if we accepted these exclusion measures, we would be safe from arrest. The important thing at the time was to abide by the law.
The Jews have to keep their heads down and cannot expect anything from the French state. Following France's surrender in 1940, Marshal Pétain wholeheartedly embraced collaboration. The vice president of his Council of Ministers, Pierre Laval, even declared publicly, "The enemies of the Reich are now the enemies of Vichy." And the Jews were enemy number 1. For the French government, they were everywhere, in the media, education, politics, the arts, and had to be removed. And so, in a document authenticated by Serge Klarsfeld in 2010, Pétain himself put the finishing touches to a piece of legislation that would make the Jews a distinct race.
It was the Vichy government on its own responsibility that took the first measures against Jews. There was a law about the purge of the civil service, which was clearly directed at Jews. And then in August, there were laws about the medical profession and the legal profession, which were supposed to be cleansed of Jews.
In 2 short years, Vichy had made France a hostile land for the Jews. The regime was just 1 step away from committing an unspeakable act. May 5th, 1942, 2 months before the roundup. An airplane touches down near Paris, with Reinhard Heydrich aboard. Himmler's second in command, he is chief of the RHSA, which wields authority over all security and police forces in Germany, the Gestapo, the Kripo, and the SIPO SD.
Heydrich was the Third Reich's super minister of the interior, not only for Germany, but for all Nazi-occupied Europe. He was the chief mastermind of the Holocaust, and he oversaw the implementation of the final solution decided by Hitler and Himmler. And so in the spring of 1942, he was one of the Third Reich's top men.
Heydrich came to the City of Lights to organize the hunt for Jews. And for this, he was counting on the help of the French, and in particular, their chief of police, René Bousquet. A lawyer at 18, principal private secretary to the prefect of Tarn-et-Garonne at 20, prefect of the Marne at 31. At the age of 33, he was the most powerful man in France after Laval and Marshal Pétain.
Bousquet had both a real and a deep commitment to the state and was ruthlessly ambitious.
He was the prototype of what we'd now call a technocrat. He was the epitome of a senior public official and quite brilliant. Bousquet was highly intelligent.
The meeting takes place in the plush surroundings of the Ritz, with great fanfare and in front of the cameras.
Bousquet bounds into the room with his hand outstretched to shake Heydrich's hand. He looks like a young football star. He was absolutely thrilled with his role and determined to carry it out in the most active sort of way.
What the cameras don't show is the behind-the-scenes negotiations. Because Bousquet wants full control of the French police in the occupied zone, which has been under direct German rule since the armistice. Heydrich sees the advantages of such an arrangement, as his own police forces are non-existent in the unoccupied zone and small in numbers in the occupied zone.
There are just 3,000 members of the German police, of what is mistakenly called the Gestapo, that is, the SIPO-SD, who are tasked with all sorts of missions, from dealing with the resistance to tackling the black market and carrying out intelligence operations. This means the Germans cannot implement the final solution in the occupied zone. They absolutely need the assistance of the French police.
According to German archives, Heydrich makes his move and tests the Frenchman, who has never openly expressed anti-Semitic sentiments.
Heydrich said to him, "We're going to deport 5,000 Jews, all men, from the occupied zone to Germany." And Bousquet immediately says, "Why not take the stateless Jews we've interned in the unoccupied zone as well?"
The stateless Jews. Families, including Germans and Austrians, who had been stripped of their nationality by the Nazis and taken refuge in France before the war. Arrested in 1940 by order of the Vichy regime, most are now interned in the unoccupied zone in the camps of Riefsalt and Gurs.
There was this extraordinary moment when Bousquet offered to turn over to the Germans the Jews who were living in the unoccupied zone, which is something absolutely unknown in Europe. The Germans took the Jews from the areas they occupied, but there's nowhere else where Jews were delivered up to the Germans from unoccupied areas.
Carefully recorded in the archives of the SS, this conversation proves that Bousquet, General Secretary of the Police, promised the Nazis 10,000 more Jews than they had requested. In doing so, the Frenchman set the wheels in motion for the VelDHiv Roundup. Three weeks later, a second incident hastens events. In Prague, Reinhard Heydrich is mortally wounded in his car by the Czech resistance. The Nazi party holds an elaborate funeral ceremony and swears to avenge his death. At the Berlin headquarters of the IVB4, the department responsible for Jewish affairs in the final solution, a meeting is hastily arranged. Chaired by Adolf Eichmann, the regime's expert on the Jewish question, in charge of organizing the final solution. Around him, his representatives in Belgium, the Netherlands, and France.
Around Adolf Eichmann was a small number of men, the Judenreferat. These men were zealous, driven by anti-Semitism.
And the deportation of the Jews of Western Europe was decided. The final solution was launched in Western Europe in reprisal for Heydrich's assassination.
According to the secret archives of the SS, the VelDHiv Roundup was decided in this Berlin office. First, Jews of both sexes aged 16 to 40 will be targeted. Trains carrying 1,000 Jews will supply the Reich's concentration camps and death camps every week. A plan tailor-made for an ambitious young man of 29, Theodor Dannecker, who is in charge of the Jewish question in France.
Dannecker is a fanatical anti-Semite, extremely anti-Jewish, brutal. And at the meeting, Dannecker promises to arrest 100,000 Jews in France.
That blockhead in the Netherlands says 15,000, and that loser in Belgium says 10,000. I'm going to show you that I can deliver 100,000.
After some discussion, it is agreed that Dannecker will deliver 40,000 Jews from France by the end of 1942. Paris, 3 weeks before the roundup. Theodor Dannecker informs Vichy. The French police must make themselves available to him for a first roundup in the occupied zone. 40% of the Jews arrested will be French. This mere detail for Dannecker could scupper the entire operation.
Laval and Bousquet tell him it's impossible for the time being. We'll start with foreign Jews, then we'll see.
Vichy is not opposed to the deportation of Jews, but if they are French Jews, then the Germans will have to make the arrest themselves.
Eichmann and Dannecker are totally panicked because the trains they ordered from the German Ministry of Transport must be filled, and there are no Jews to put in these trains. Who will arrest them? Because the German army is not in favor of these deportations. It even refuses at one point to escort the Jews. Himmler actually complains about this. He says the fact that so few Jews have been deported from France is due to the German army's lack of willing.
July 2nd, 1942, Bousquet is summoned to Paris. General Oberg, chief of the SS and the German police in France, and his second-in-command, Helmut Nocken, have been ordered to make the Frenchmen accept. Reported in an SS document and revealed by Serge Klarsfeld, this meeting will plunge France into its darkest hours.
Nocken explains to Bousquet, this is so important to the Führer that you cannot expect the least understanding from him. This means there is going to be a crisis. But he does not say what. There is no German ultimatum. The only ultimatum they make is possible reprisals by Hitler if Vichy refuses to deploy the French police.
Bousquet is not fooled. The Germans are bluffing. They cannot jeopardize a collaboration so useful to the war effort. And yet, quite unexpectedly, Bousquet agrees, but on two conditions. The police will only round up foreign Jews and, most importantly, he becomes the undisputed chief of the French police.
It is Bousquet who led Laval and Pétain to deploy the French police. And that is a completely unforgivable crime. He is not aware of the enormity of the crime that he is committing vis-à-vis France.
And so, thanks to Bousquet, the Vichy government undertakes to arrest and turn over to the occupying forces thousands of Jewish families during an operation carried out solely by the French police. The Great Roundup will take place. Paris, a few hours before the operation gets underway. In the capital's Jewish quarters, behind closed windows and doors, a rumor spreads. A roundup of Jews is imminent.
My mother must have heard, because the night before, it must have spread like wildfire. She hid us at our paternal grandparents' home, which was 50 meters from ours.
At the time, lots of rumors were circulating in our neighborhood, which had a sizable Jewish population. And my mother remained convinced until the end that what had happened in Germany could never happen in France.
Men, the target of arrests until now, flee their homes. Yet Laval had already approved the Germans' request to arrest women. He went even further. At a secret meeting, he offered to arrest all children between the ages of 2 and 15.
I think genuinely did not want to have thousands of orphan children in his care, and so he covered it as a humanitarian act. He wanted the families to stay together.
Laval has no other choice because he has made a criminal decision. The criminal decision is to arrest the Jews. What explanation can he give? He can't say to the French, listen, the Germans are going to kill the parents, so we're not giving them the children because they will likely die as well. He can't say that. And that is why he asks that the children be taken too, so that they won't pose a problem for him.
Children born for the most part in France and therefore French. Yet Laval, Pétain, and Bousquet had claimed they wanted to spare the French Jews. And so, the wish of collaborationist writer Robert Brasillach was granted. When discussing the deportation of Jews, he had written, "And above all, don't forget the children." Paris, July 16, 1942, 4 a.m. All over the city, 4,500 police officers receive lists of addresses to visit and names to arrest. 22,000 men and women carefully selected a few days previously thanks to the Jewish registry, which was compiled in 1940 and 1941.
It was put together by a fonctionnaire named André Tullard, who was a very systematic man and who had a very elaborate color-coded set of cards with the names and addresses and the countries of origin of all the Jews that they were able to locate in France.
The purpose of these files was not to carry out arrests, but to control the Jewish population. But in 1942, the files became instruments for organizing roundups. These extremely precise and extremely well-organized records were used to identify those to be arrested.
The police chiefs give their instructions. Arrested Jews must first be taken to assembly centers, police stations, schools, and gymnasiums requisitions for the purpose. Operations must be carried out with maximum speed and without pointless speaking. In the district of Ménilmontant, Rachel Jedinak and her sister, hiding at their grandparents' home, are woken up at first light.
I heard pounding on the door. Police, open up. Come on, children, get dressed quickly. You're going to join your mother. My grandmother tried to reason with them. They're just children, but it was no use. We went down to join our mother, and on the way, one of the two police officers said, jeeringly, "You can thank your concierge. She told us where you were." We were denounced, the both of us, by our concierge.
Rue des Abbesses in the 18th district. Joseph Weissman is with his mother and two sisters when the police burst into the family home.
I only remember the plainclothes officer. His face was totally blank. There was no brutality whatsoever, but his face was terrifying. He had the eyes of a dead fish.
His father is in his workshop on the 6th floor.
Mum said to me, "Go fetch Dad." I went up to the 6th floor and said, "Dad, the police have come to arrest us. Mum told me to come and get you." I got a lot of flack afterwards. "Don't you realize you denounced your father?" There was never any question of my dad letting his family go to protect himself. So I went and got my father.
Rue de Sévigné, the police come for Annette Kreischer, her sister, and her mother. All three are frog-marched through the streets as Paris wakes up and discovers the citywide arrests.
I remember how afraid I was. I was only 12. that people would see us and think we had done something wrong because we had been arrested by the police. My reaction was one of shame.
As we walked through the streets, I saw people gathered at their windows, others lining the sidewalks. I looked around. I saw several make the sign of the cross with tears in their eyes. I was only 8, but I understood that the Parisians didn't agree with what was being done to us.
The Jew described on the radio and in the press, a monster who dominates the world, who's plotting against France or Germany, is actually your upstairs neighbor. The kids who go to school with your kids. All of a sudden, the Jew isn't this monstrous creature portrayed by the anti-Semites anymore, but someone just like everyone else.
Rachel Jedinak, her mother and her sister are brought to the Bellevilloise, one of the many centers the Jews were taken to before they were grouped together.
There were a few hundred of us in there, all packed together. The police were blowing their whistles and shouting. My mother was determined to get us out of there. And a neighbor came up to my mother and told her that Leah, her eldest daughter, who was 14, had managed to escape via the emergency exit. So my mother turned to us and said, "Do what Leah did. You can't stay here. Go over to the emergency exit. And if the police push you back, just stay put." I didn't want to let go of my mother. I screamed, "I don't want to leave you." Then my mother slapped me very hard. She'd never slapped me before. Later, I realized that that slap had saved my life.
The 2 officers guarding the rear entrance look away and let the 2 fugitives escape. The young sisters go and hide at their grandparents' home. All over the city, the arrests continue while the sorting centers are gradually cleared. Childless couples and single people are taken to the internment camp at Drancy, northeast of Paris, and families to Rue Nélaton, close to the Eiffel Tower.
The buses arrived, and we were driven to the Vélodrome d'hiver.
The Vélodrome d'hiver, nicknamed the VelDHiv, Paris's mecca of sports. The now demolished stadium was built in 1909 to host cycling competitions, which were all the rage back then. 180 meters long by 90 meters wide, the steel structure can accommodate 17,000 spectators on the fold-away seats of its brick and concrete bleachers. Below, the banked timber track surrounds a huge infield.
Places were needed to accommodate so many people. And the Vélodrome d'hiver was one of the largest buildings in Paris at the time, in downtown Paris.
On the morning of July 16th, the first buses arrive at the Vélodrome. The area is sealed off. Word must not get out. A single photo was secretly taken from one of these windows. The only visible trace of the VelDHiv Roundup.
The photo that was found was apparently taken by a press photographer. But it's an extraordinary photo. There is no desire to show what's going on, and that was the case for all roundups of 1942 and later. The roundups and arrests associated with the final solution were not publicized by the state.
Annette and Joseph discover the VelDHiv. The heat is suffocating, amplified by a gigantic glass roof painted dark blue to avoid detection by Allied bombers.
And we had a surprise, a terrible surprise, on seeing the stadium packed to the rafters with people, lots and lots and lots of people.
On the first day, There are over 6,000 people sitting on the fold-away seats or directly on the floor.
There were loudspeakers blaring. We couldn't hear them, not properly. A terrible noise, shouting, a crowd, whole families, children, and fear. Absolute fear.
It was indescribable. It was chaos. One woman jumped to her death from the top of the bleachers and lay in a pool of blood. At that point, I retreated into a kind of bubble. I tried not to breathe too loudly, to make a sound, or to move at all. I made myself as small as possible.
By the end of the day on July 17th, 4,150 children, 2,916 women, and 1,129 men are trapped in the VelDHiv's Great Hall. All the exits are closely guarded by the French police. Armed with guns, they have received orders not to respond to any requests, even the most basic.
The French public service has a history of total incompetence. No preparations whatsoever had been made.
There was nothing to eat. All the toilets were blocked in no time. And after 5 days, you can imagine the stench.
And those were the conditions in which we spent 3 days and nights in that hellhole, not knowing how long we'd be there, when we could have something to drink or use the toilet, or what was going to happen to us.
What will become of them? The Jews at the VelDHiv have no idea. But Himmler, head of the SS and Gestapo, on a tour of Poland and the Ukraine, knows full well. By an accident of history, the day the Jews are herded into the Vélodrome d'hiver, he is inspecting his Jew-killing machine.
Among other things, he spent 2 days at Auschwitz inspecting the facilities, and in particular, the extermination facilities. And we know that on July the 17th, Himmler attended the gassing of a convoy from the Netherlands and saw how these operations were organized at Auschwitz.
And so, in July 1942, although unfinished, the Auschwitz killing center is already operational. This is where the majority of those arrested as part of the VelDHiv Roundup would end up.
But the fact is, the extermination facilities were archaic and rudimentary at the time. When the convoys of Jews arrived at Auschwitz, they got out of the cattle cars and were marched to the gas chambers, which were in converted Polish farmhouses. So it wasn't an industrial-scale operation. But the killers, the SS, the Wehrmacht, and other German units constantly tried to improve the extermination process.
The Nazis' horrific killing machine has been set in motion. It will need its daily quota of Jews. Meanwhile, in Vichy, it is time for Laval and Pétain to take stock. In all, 13,152 Jews have been arrested. This is well below the target of 22,000 arrests set by the Germans.
All the roundups produced unsatisfactory results due to the lack of enthusiasm of the French police, who knew that what they were doing was a violation of people's rights.
There were police who thought it was a terrifically good idea to arrest and deport Jews. There were other police who were revolted by this order. A certain number of them, there's some very well documented stories of police who knocked on the door and said, "I'm coming back in 2 hours, wink, wink, do what you need to do." And smart people, particularly those who had come out of Poland, knew what terrible things might happen.
How many police officers were reluctant to execute orders? No one knows for sure. At the VelDHiv, Annette came across an officer near the latrines.
We found a police officer there who was totally distraught and who said he couldn't believe they'd been put in this situation, that they had been forced to do such a thing. I still remember him very clearly because he was the only person, the only French person in uniform to show us any humanity,
On July 19th, after 4 days of being held in appalling conditions, the families were gradually moved from the VelDHiv and bused to the Gare d'Austerlitz in East Paris.
We were herded towards the goods station, where we saw a number of cattle cars, and we were loaded into these cattle cars, which were mainly used to transport horses.
The doors were nailed shut, and we set off. There was no water, obviously, and just one chamber pot for 200 people. There was a tiny window in a corner of the car. From time to time, a parent would lift their child up to it so they could get some air. It was absolutely suffocating. We were packed like sardines. I remember how hard it was to breathe. That's all I remember. When is this going to end? I can't take any more.
After a terrible 5-hour journey, Annette, her sister, and her mother alight at Pithiviers, 75 kilometers south of Paris. Joseph and his family at Beaune-la-Rolande, 17 kilometers down the line. 2 villages in the Loiret, where internment camps had been built in 1939. Intended for prisoners of war, they had become French-controlled transit camps for Jewish deportees. All that remains of the camp at Pithiviers is this silo. But at the time, it spread over 400 meters. It consisted of 19 huts, a guardroom, an infirmary, a canteen, kitchens, a workshop, and latrines. The camp was fenced in by several rows of barbed wire and surrounded by watchtowers equipped with searchlights to reduce the risk of escape. When Annette and her family walk through its gates, they are taken to hut number 18.
A typical wooden hut with row upon row of wooden bunks covered with straw. We were to live the life of internees in an internment camp with guards who treated us as prisoners and ignored the fact we were families and children.
By July 22nd, the camp had 4,471 internees, half of whom were children. This was almost twice its designated capacity of 2,300 prisoners.
The huts, which were designed to hold 100 to 120 people, had twice that amount. As you can imagine, there weren't enough bunks, so the camp authorities requisitioned a huge shed in which they put some 2,000 people.
In the north of the camp, this shed had been used to store straw for the German army. Forgotten for many years, its existence was revealed thanks to recently unearthed archives. This letter written by a prisoner is decisive proof.
I have been at Pithiviers for a week now. There are 2,400 of us in a shed, including women and many children. We sleep on the floor on a bit of straw, and the children pee and vomit on it. If we have to stay here for 2 weeks, most of us will be dead, especially the children. The vast majority of the children slept on the floor on straw that was never changed. So you can imagine the sanitary conditions. They had no spare clothes. They soon became louse-ridden. They got sick. There were epidemics, especially diphtheria, and no medication, of course.
17 kilometers away, in the camp at Beaune-la-Rolande, conditions were not much better. Separated from his mother and 2 sisters, Joseph was put in hut number 8 with his father.
The sanitary facilities were pretty much non-existent. There was a pipe from this window to that window, with a tap every meter or 50 centimeters, and we all washed in front of each other. To do your business, there was a plank with holes 50 centimeters apart, and underneath it was what we called a tinette, a sort of laundry basin. It fell into the basin in front of everyone. It was humiliating. They were always humiliating us.
On July 31st, 4 convoys are to leave for Auschwitz. The fathers will go first, then it will be the mother's turn. As for the children, they will follow later.
And that is when the darkest chapter of France's history was written. Discreetly, in the camps of the Loiret, a fair distance from Paris, the police brutally separated the parents from their children. 3,000 very young children were left on their own, and their mothers and fathers were deported to Auschwitz.
The night before, a gendarme came and stood outside our hut and read out the names of the mothers who were on the list. Mother was on the list. It was horrendous. We had one night left together. And that night, I wanted to stop time forever. I cuddled up to Mother. It was horrendous.
The following morning, in the camps at Boulle-la-Rolande and Pithiviers, the gendarmes gather the mothers together behind the barbed wire and resort to force, snatching their children from their arms. For Annette, Joseph, and their 4,155 wretched young companions, it is time to say farewell.
We couldn't even touch each other because the barbed wire pricked us. In the sun, I was distraught, totally distraught. It was horrendous. Mother giving us her final instructions and saying, "Children, be dignified, stick together, and above all, don't lose heart, because I'll come back." That's how it was. And then a gendarme barked an order, and all the women turned around and walked away. We saw a large group of women. We lost sight of our mother, and that's the last image I have of my mother.
All of a sudden, the camp was empty. After the apocalyptic chaos, there was a deafening silence. That silence was far, far worse than the noise.
At Boulle-la-Rolande and Pithiviers, thousands of children deprived of their parents are held prisoner by the French gendarmes. The youngest do not even know their own names. In hut number 18, Annette and her sister are among the eldest. All of 12 and 15 years old, they are named second in command of the hut.
The children wept, called for their mothers, cried out, and then very quickly they fell silent. It was as if they were autistic. They stopped speaking and playing. They were in their own worlds and wouldn't accept anything from us.
The same day at Vichy. At the Council of Ministers, Bousquet is congratulated by Laval. His precious agreement for a unified police force under his control has been rubber-stamped by the Germans. The French police has regained its sovereignty. But at what cost?
Those who made the decisions didn't even see the Jews. Laval never set foot in a camp. Bousquet never visited a camp. They never witnessed the suffering of those people. They didn't want to see it either. When you make inhumane decisions, you keep your distance rather than approach your victims.
On August 12, 1942, the SS give the order to transfer the children. They are bused to Drancy, northeast of Paris. where a half-completed pre-war housing estate serves as an internment camp. It will become known as the antechamber of Auschwitz. The huge U-shaped estate consists of several five-story apartment blocks accessed by stairs. They all lead to a huge courtyard, the end of which is closed off by several rows of barbed wire and a guard room. Around the perimeter, there are watchtowers.
I just broke down because I had the impression it was a real camp, a tough camp. There were these big apartment blocks and a courtyard whose ground was black. Not a single tree. People clinging to the windows.
In the summer of 1942, in the space of a few weeks, almost 30,000 people were sent here and stayed 24, 48, 72 hours. Drancy became a hub, the country's chief transit camp for deportations to the east, chiefly to Auschwitz.
Upon arrival, the thousands of children are herded into empty rooms in the estate's east wing, the deportees block. Those for whom deportation to Auschwitz is imminent.
There was just straw on the floor. The children were slumped on the ground. The lack of food, the lack of water, their dysentery had worsened. They weren't human anymore. They were wretched.
Outside the camp, onlookers crowd behind the fence. Some are relatives hoping to catch a glimpse of their loved ones inside. This is what Rachel and her sister did.
The detainees went to the very top of the building. It's etched in my memory. And they tried to spot the people who'd come to see them. I couldn't see my mother, and I walked away crying with my sister. The second time, a gentleman saw me crying and lent me a pair of binoculars. And from a distance, I was able to see my mother's face. She saw us, she recognized us, and she did this. Run, run, because the gendarmes used to chase us around the perimeter of the camp. We were in constant danger. That was the last time I saw my mother.
August 21st, the first convoy of children is announced. Stairways 1, 2, and 3.
We heard the gendarmes shouting. We heard the children crying. We looked down the stairs and saw the children having their heads shaved before they left. Because I found this out later, the SS at Auschwitz were really afraid the children would bring lice with them. For me, that was the worst thing that could happen to us. I thought it was an absolutely dreadful ordeal, and we would have to face it.
Between August 21st and August 26, 1942, 4,051 VelDHiv children were deported to Auschwitz. Upon arrival, they were taken to the killing chambers and gassed. Rosette, age 9, Samuel, 3, Henri, 9, Kira, 7, Paul, 11, Monique, 3, Hélène, 7, Charles, 2. Aline, murdered on her 3rd birthday. A fate Vichy must have been aware of.
In the summer of 1942, news began circulating around Europe about what was being done to the Jews in occupied Poland. It was mentioned on the BBC, it was mentioned in the British and American press, it was mentioned in the clandestine newspapers of the communist and Gaullist resistance in France. There were French intelligence reports saying there was such and such a rumor about the treatment of the Jews. There were even rumors that the Jews were being gassed.
At one point, Laval talked about what he should tell journalists, and it was agreed that he would say that they were going to agricultural colonies in Poland. However, the conditions of the voyage were such that they could expect the worst. So with any effort to know, they knew that this trip was destined to kill people.
August 31st, 1942, Lyon. You will not have the children. Those were Cardinal Gerlier's words to the prefect. The Vichy official had demanded he hand over the 108 Jewish children spirited out of the camp at Vénissieux by Catholic relief organizations. As 5 days previously, the second phase of the roundups of the summer of 1942 had begun. The second act forgotten by history. The arrest by the French police of 10,000 Jews in the unoccupied zone.
Roundups in the unoccupied zone were carried out in broad daylight and in the center of town. And so there were these absolutely horrifying scenes of separation between children and mothers that were witnessed by large numbers of ordinary French citizens all over the southern zone.
And this roundup shocked the French people profoundly. And not only the people, but the French spiritual elite as well. In other words, the Catholic Church and the leaders of the Reformed Church.
Was the Church, a pillar of the regime, about to abandon Vichy? At any rate, this was the decision of a number of influential prelates, who did not hesitate to publicly condemn Pétain for his treatment of the Jews. More worrying still for the regime, police reports mention public outrage at the mass arrests. The situation is explosive. Laval implores the Germans, do not demand more Jews. The SS chiefs in France realize they will have to ease up to avoid antagonizing public opinion.
Knochen obtained Himmler's support for what I would describe as a restrained policy whereby they would obtain the maximum number of Jews possible without creating difficulties for Vichy's leaders. If Vichy eased off its intense police collaboration with the Germans, it is entirely thanks to the Church and the French people.
The arrests in France did not cease, but there were far fewer. As for the rate of deportations demanded by the Germans, the objectives were never met. During the summer of 1942, Vichy turned over more than 30,000 Jews to the Nazis, including 13,152 arrested in the VelDHiv roundup. Just 50 would survive the hell of the camps. Annette and her sister escaped deportation. One of their aunts, who was a social worker, managed to secure their release.
When they called out the names, and we were the only 2 children to get out of Drancy, it was a truly terrible shock. The departure of the children left a gaping void. So the 2 of us walked out of Drancy wearing the star, and from that day on, I was free.
Joseph hid in an orphanage in Paris's 18th district. A few weeks earlier, he had escaped from the camp at Boulogne-la-Rolande with another Joseph, aged 11 like him.
One of us had a brilliant idea and said, there's a point in the day when the camp is totally empty, when there's no one about. And that's when everyone goes to the canteen shed to get the day's meal. It was the highlight of the day. And it was at noon. So at noon, we crawled under the barbed wire. With our little arms and hands, we raised the barbed wire, and it took us 5 or 6 hours to get through all the rows of barbed wire. And when they did the roll call, 2 Josephs were missing. They looked for us everywhere. I found out later. It was unacceptable for 2 snotty-nosed 11-year-old kids to slip through such a tight net. But we did it.
After the war, the head of the Vichy government, Pierre Laval, was found guilty of treason and executed on October 15, 1945, at Fresnes prison. 2 months later, interned by the Americans, the German Theodor Dannecker committed suicide in his cell. Sentenced to life in prison, SS officers Karl Oberg and Helmut Nacken were discreetly released in 1962 by order of General de Gaulle. As for the chief of police, René Bousquet, he was acquitted after a rushed trial, but indicted for crimes against humanity 40 years later, thanks to Serge Klarsfeld's investigation. Murdered by a deranged individual shortly before his trial, justice was cheated. None involved ever expressed the slightest remorse.